Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this OTC Asia 2022 live, our first expert panel live stream for OTC Asia 2022. Welcome, everybody. Now, you've tuned in today and found an hour out of your time. Why is that? It's because the question is on everyone's mind: what is the vision for offshore petroleum in 2050? And I think it's a great question too. It's of great interest to me. My name is Neil Kavanagh. I'm the chair of the Oversight Committee at OTC. I'm a director of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And in my day job, I'm the chief scientist at Woodside Energy in Australia. And in a moment, I'll introduce our panel. But first of all, how will this vision for offshore petroleum play out in 2020, and why do we care? There's no doubt we want to know how it will affect our careers and jobs, where we might work, but also the quality of life that we might enjoy generally in the economy, and specifically in a future climate-affected life, not just for us, but for our family and children too. Now, you'll all have read all the latest IPCC reports, and you'll be fully briefed on the facts and the figures around reducing emissions towards net zero by 2050. So what does that mean in Asia, where offshore petroleum production is so predominant? And how will new offshore technology shape these remaining 28 years towards net zero? There's no doubt that it's a mixture of political, commercial, and technological factors that are interplaying. And I think you would agree with me that Asia does lead the world in many of the offshore resources technologies, whether it's shipbuilding and the yards, whether it's deep water development, unmanned facilities, floating LNG. Some of the largest production floaters are in our region. But most significantly, in my view, is the fact is that Asia is the socio-economic center when it comes to affordable energy in the world. Where we have this big and fast-growing population. Today's 7 billion person population is 4 billion in Asia, one in Africa, 1 billion in Europe, and 1 billion in the Americas, but 4 in Asia. And as it grows towards 9 billion, that'll be an extra 1 billion in Asia and an additional 1 billion in Africa. And so there are many fragile communities here who are vulnerable both to economic shocks and also to changes to their built environment and their living environment as we think about elevated sea levels and more intense storms. What the answer will be, I do not know, and we'll hear about it from the panel now. Could it be hydrogen? Could it be CCUS? Could it be the very large subsea high voltage DC interconnecting cables? Or is it all about fugitive emissions? There's no doubt that Asia will show the way and that Asia will lead the way by way of consumption. So let me begin by handing you over to our first speaker, who is John Torkington. John is a principal consultant based in Perth. He's got some wonderful experiences guiding Australian oil and gas companies, but also state and federal governments on energy and climate change over many years. So it's my pleasure to hand over to John, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that introduction, Neil. Look, setting out a vision for the oil and gas industry over the next 30 years, I find incredibly challenging. And to set the scene for this afternoon's discussion, I'd like to step back a bit and consider what addressing climate change means to the oil and gas industry and by association, the offshore technology sector. While some might not agree with this contention, I think if we're to truly address issues posed by climate change, then it's likely that we will not see an oil and gas industry by 2050, at least not as we think of it today. While the use of greenhouse gas offsets and technologies such as CCS may enable the continued use of some fossil fuels, it's hard to see how, in a world of net zero greenhouse gas emissions, the use of fossil fuels can provide more than a niche role in meeting global energy demand. And I observe that many oil and gas producers, while committing to net zero emissions by 2050, point to the IEA World Energy Outlook to justify continued oil and gas production in emissions-constrained world. But I think I'm right in saying, however, that the industry was a lot quieter when the IEA released its net zero emissions report last year, which stated if the world is to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, then there can be no new gas developments starting now. And I think the IEA World Energy Outlook and its net zero emissions report are emblematic of a disconnect that we see between what needs to be done to avoid the significant impacts of climate change and what is likely to occur over the next 30 years. In effect, the net zero report sets out what needs to happen to keep global temperatures to less than 2 degrees. And in this world, oil and gas is very much in decline. Whereas the energy outlook sets out plausible scenarios around how demand and supply of energy are likely to evolve over the next 30 years. So going forward, it'd be really interesting to see how the IEA integrates this view of net zero, which is around what needs to happen, into its World Energy Outlook, which is really scenarios around what they see happening. I should highlight that this disconnect between the rhetoric espousing support for deep emissions cuts and what is occurring is not restricted to the oil and gas industry. Just about everywhere you look across the globe, and with only a few exceptions, the rhetoric from our political industry leaders across the agriculture, cities, transport sectors and individuals does not match what is required to get to net zero emissions by 2050. A lot of the statements our industry has made has focused on reducing emissions from our operations, but it's the demand for oil and gas that will dictate the future of this industry. And to illustrate how demand for oil and gas may change over the next 30 years, I was recently involved in some modelling for the future energy supply infrastructure for an Australian state. Now, this state is currently heavily dependent on both coal and gas to meet its energy needs, and the challenge is to look at what that state's energy system looks like in 2050 in a zero emissions world. And that work that I was involved in showed that moving to an energy supply system with no coal or gas or CCS for that matter was surprisingly achievable from a technical perspective. That is, it could do it. The one challenge, of course, was, and this was not part of this study, was that it remained a very difficult conversation about the policy settings required to achieve this transition. And it will be the national policy settings across the globe that are key here. And it's this area where I'm not optimistic. 20 years ago, governments, at least in some jurisdictions, were establishing macroeconomic policy settings to drive the required emissions reductions. And while governments continue to talk about the urgent need to address emissions, it's hard to see any significant macroeconomic reform any government has introduced in the last 10 years with the objective of further driving down greenhouse gas emissions. My contention is that governments appear to be no longer interested in setting the macroeconomic settings or the reform required to drive these emissions reductions. Rather, industry is left to respond to pressure from investors and stakeholders, and this creates some complex layers of uncertainty. For example, recently Australia was seeing tension between investors seeking their firms they invest in to drive emissions reductions and those investors that are focused on dividends and return on invested funds, and there does seem to be an emerging tension there. So what does all this mean for the offshore technology industry? If the world regains its mojo to reduce emissions and keep global temperature rises below 2 degrees, I think it's likely an offshore oil and gas industry may not exist in 2050, or rather it will be a niche industry fulfilling specific needs such as supply of lubricating oils or chemical feedstocks. Relevant to this audience, though, there is an exception, and that is the need to decommission a large number of offshore oil and gas facilities, many of which may have had to be retired early, and a time when the revenue the industry is counting on to fund that decommissioning may also have collapsed. But there is some hope for the offshore technology sector. We're already starting to see the skills and technologies developed in the oil and gas industry being deployed in areas such as offshore wind farms, and I am aware of some studies looking at floating hydrogen and ammonia production facilities. I think Neil touched on those at the opening remarks. So we could see a vibrant offshore energy industry involving exploitation of offshore renewable resources and the construction, for example, of offshore hydrogen and ammonia plants, undersea power cables, etc. And of course, there remains the possibility, some might contend the likelihood that the world moves much more slowly to net zero emissions. And it's worth noting in this regard, the IPCC did say to keep global temperatures to no more than 2 degrees, we had to get to net zero emissions in the second half of this century. The mantra around 2050 seems to be if you want to get to 1.5 degrees. So in which case, we maybe still have an oil and gas industry in 2050, although one that may well be in decline. However, in this world, I expect the industry will remain unloved, and the challenges we are already seeing today of attracting and retaining good people, maintaining regulatory support and investor confidence will be increasingly more difficult. So with that, I'll hand back to Neil.
Thank you very much, John. Fantastic. And we will come back to you with some questions in a moment. And for now, I'd like to introduce Professor Eric May. Eric, I've known for many years, also based in Perth like me. And Eric is the CEO of the Cooperative Research Centre for Future Energy Exports, based in Perth, and is a well-established professor at UWA and a specialist in chemical engineering and in energy matters. So Eric, welcome to Livestream, and over to you.
Thank you, Neil. It's a great privilege to have this opportunity to speak to the OTC Asia community. I'm going to take a slightly different tack to John's, although I acknowledge many of his problems, particularly the tension he's pointing to with respect to projections of demand for energy versus the requirements of eliminating emissions. And I'm focused here on why the offshore petroleum industry is already providing a crucial function to the world, and in my opinion, will need to continue doing so. So the plots show world population, as Neil alluded to in his opening remarks, growing but leveling off as around the end of the century, whilst world energy consumption keeps growing. And that is because even though we're not having more and more people on Earth, the standards of living and the quality of life that most in the West take for granted will increasingly be shared around places like Asia and Africa, as it should. And so whilst there is certainly an imperative to reduce carbon emissions, we don't burn fossil fuels for no reason. We use them because they improve people's lives. And that is something that we need to figure out how to do whilst balancing the demand on the environment. But there are many cases where fixing the problem of carbon emissions could actually end up making the world worse off. So any credible prediction of energy prediction into the future shows all forms of energy, even nuclear, likely to be maintained or maybe grow. Certainly natural gas is projected to grow. And so whilst its share of the total might decrease slightly, the total amount probably will increase. And projections about the share of renewable sources of energy growing often discount the fact, particularly in terms of the rate at which they grow, that all forms of energy have positive and negative attributes, and we shouldn't forget that. And the attributes, and if we go to the next slide, I'm going to pick on one particular set of challenges which might hinder, for example, the rate at which hydrogen takes off in the coming century, even though that is what our research center is working as hard as we can to address. So hydrogen, this is a set of challenges that face hydrogen, but all forms of energy, particularly the renewable sector, have similar challenges, and we can talk about them later, perhaps in the questions. The three for hydrogen that I tend to focus on are cost. People often talk about, a price of hydrogen dollars per kilogram, but they really should be talking about dollars per gigajoule. And to go from dollars per kilogram to dollars per gigajoule, you need to multiply by 8. So even in countries that need to import LNG at $11 a gigajoule, if you're talking $2 to $3 a kilogram of hydrogen, you're well above that. And the price we pay for energy now is much lower, even as the price of gas is at quite a relatively recent high. The other issue is scale. To get to the amounts of renewables that we need, you need to start deploying large amounts of the tens of gigawatts scale. But, in terms of the capacity of countries to do this, most of them doing more than 10 gigawatts a year would be, a significant effort, and not to mention challenges on supply chains. And then social license concerns. Once renewables start rolling out, they too will have an impact on the environment. And the figures shown here look at, complaints in the United States of Joshua Tree reserves being cleared for installation of solar panels. So there are all sorts of potential conflicts with hydrogen. There's also the issue with water. So what this means is that decarbonisation will not happen overnight, in my opinion. And whilst the offshore petroleum industry must and will evolve, I wouldn't predict that it will have anything like a demise by 2050. Thanks. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you very much indeed, Eric. It's now my pleasure to introduce, and we'll come back to those points in the Q&A. You've raised some, I've got a whole list of questions myself. And to everyone who's listening, please do forward your questions in right away. Stephanie is notating them and we'll pass them up to the panel in a moment. Everything that you've heard that you agree with or that you don't agree with, please let us know. I'd like to now introduce Tran. Tran No, based in Singapore with IntexC, is a senior flow assurance engineer. Tran is having a very busy day today, not only speaking to you on this panel, but in fact giving a technical talk tonight on the dehydration of CO2 for the purposes of CCUS. So I can't think of a better time to introduce Tran and to talk about her vision for 2050 offshore petroleum. Thank you. Over to you, Tran.
Thank you, Neil. So I'm very delighted to be here today to discuss and share our thought about the offshore petroleum in the next 30 years. Obviously, we have heard about several of large organizations that already announced their net zero carbon emission goals by 2050, and conventional oil and gas business, in fact, they need to take the calls for the long-term decarbonization and an energy transition path. However, as highlighted by Eric, that the transition won't be easy. The upstream industry is need to be subject to like a lot of challenges by improving its environmental footprint, by the processes improvements. And for me, I'm looking at very different angles. People at the core who plays a very positive role in driving this change and have the transformation. Change isn't enough. We need to evolve and thrive. So the industry will always out-innovate. As an engineer like me, we need to strategize, elevate the skill, never stop innovating and creating the new value added. The use of the data analysis and the machine learning actually is create a lot of significant impact to the oil and gas industry. Petroleum engineers have been developing a lot of technologies in this area to enhance our abilities to manage oil and gas reservoir. Just a quick example. An engineer would normally spend 2 to 3 hours analyzing data from a well built-up test, doing history matchings of the reservoir. But if we able to use the machine learning algorithms, we can complete the task within a few seconds. So more development in this area will actually continue to increase the need for the petroleum engineering applications to optimize and economize our operations. A lot of petroleum engineering capabilities, and one example is the drillings. It's actually also very needed and also very important to produce the new geothermal energy. And instead of designing the cables or the subsea pipeline, our subsea engineer can transfer those skills to the offshore wind cable. So besides on this skill set, on this core skill, technical skill, is very crucial for us to add on other transferables, professionals and indirect skills such as economic analysis, stakeholder management, and change management. Upskill on advanced technologies and analytics like AI, machine learning, or automations is able to help us to leverage the human machines collaborations, identify the new forms of collective intelligence, which will improve the decision making and quality control management. But behalf that we realize the key that the digital transformations is not as simple as introduce the new technology. We need to change the way how we work, from the flexibility in working using Scrum or Agile teams, as well as across the generational teams and different core businesses. So the world have already entered a major energy transition. This will have a profound influence on humanities. With the brightest mind, our drawings in our intensive experience to spark the changes for our future. Petroleum engineers need to take a lot of innovations, a lot of reactive thinking or environmental considerations and our social economics to push our effort towards the Vision 2050. Some see today, others see tomorrow, and we see both. Are you excited to lead the change for upstream oil and gas industry? Thank you. Hand over back to now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tran. I really liked the question that you've raised about change and whether we want to evolve and thrive or simply have change. I think there's no doubt that we all want tomorrow to be better. And you reminded me of that quote that when the Stone Age finished, people weren't looking sad and moping about thinking about the past. They'd simply moved on to something better. So we'll come back to that in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Tran. It's now my pleasure to introduce Amir Alwazan, who is a senior executive advisor with Dragon Oil, based in Dubai, but covering a wide region and a very interesting portfolio. We were talking in the preamble about the Caspian Sea and some of the challenges there with the offshore facilities in the Caspian Sea, which I don't know much about. So welcome, Amir, and over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. The dynamic changes in geopolitical and environmental standings, along with the proliferation of alternative energy resources, drive us to be more meticulous about the choices of the strategic elements of our industry for the next few decades. In fact, offshore petroleum assets have sustained their success through stringent executive commitments, long-term vision, and vigorous decision-making processes. In order for these developments in general to remain competitive as a reliable source of energy, strategic decision-making criteria have to aggrandize to be carbon conscious while addressing other indispensable sustainability-related encounters and challenges, namely cost reduction, assets integrity and resources, evaluation and management. As we all know, we are in one of the most regulated industries in the world, and we do not expect this status to change in the near future, maybe the other way around. Therefore, the need to tailor our processes and the practices to address this fact is crucial for us to sustain the course. Technical advancements and innovative solutions, like what Tran has mentioned, have always been instrumental for the success and sustainability of offshore developments. And it is really important to realize that the targeted net zero does not mean zero oil. It simply refers to advancing the technical capabilities to eliminate the greenhouse gas emissions. And the current and emerging challenges that we are facing in our industry mandate the need for a thorough technology rollout system with robust selection criteria to develop and implement the appropriate techniques and technologies for the next few decades. As we all know, the circumstances and the selection criteria vary from one region to another, from one operator to another. But at the end of the day, we need such a rollout system to be robust enough to consider all of these factors. The other, I consider it as an issue, and Tran also mentioned, and John also, attracting talented people for the industry is becoming another challenge. I'd not say that talented people have lost their confidence in the industry, but it is becoming an unnerving struggle for them to plan their career in the oil and gas industry due to its cyclic nature and the repeated job security related issues. We all observe that the consequences of the pandemic have worsened that, as we all know that uncertainty leads to all sorts of paradoxes. To recap, I think energy demand definitely will most probably exceed the current annual rate of 1.5 to 2% during the upcoming decades. Our industry's diversified outlook needs to be challenged quickly, but not fast, from within the industry, but without focusing on the plausibility of the assumptions. I strongly believe that it is probably the groundbreaking stage for the majors to reinvent our industry and consider having an independent offshore governing autonomous ecosystem where only the foremost and the most important decisions come from the control center. Thank you for listening. I will hand it over to Neil. Neil, it's yours. Thank you. Neil, I think you are on mute.
Yeah. Sorry, Amir, thank you. I was going to say, let's come back to you in the Q&A on that offshore autonomous system matter and link it in with what John was talking about with offshore wind and hydrogen. I think there's no doubt that those two go together. Very good. All right. Well, we've reached the time for the last speaker, and there's nobody better to round it up, I think, than Concetto Fischetti from IOGP, the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. Concetti is based in London. He's on secondment from ENI, and he has a worldwide perspective. And he's responsible, in fact, for the energy transition at IOGP. So welcome, Concetti, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'm really pleased to be here with you. And hopefully I will be also in presence in March in Kuala Lumpur. And let me start by answering my colleague Tron's question, actually, whether I am ready just to take the challenge. The answer is yes, Tron. I'm really quite excited just to pursue the journey towards net zero. And let me start in line with my colleagues from the energy demand scenarios. Let me share actually what is now quite clear status as depicted by the International Energy Agency, that basically from any kind of possible scenario, from the stated policy currently scenario through the announced pledges scenario and going to the net zero scenario, actually the weight of oil and gas within the energy demand mix is still very important. So in all scenarios, it's a confirmation of the need of oil and gas. But actually, now it's clear that this demands to a step in, a leading by example by oil and gas industry. And actually, within this important role of oil and gas industry, offshore industry will play a significant part of this role. And actually, what does it mean leading by example? Actually, lead means going through a decarbonization pathway. And this is actually what you see on your right part of the slide. All the major IOC, but I would say also the national oil company and the independent company have established a clear plan based also on the technical strength, the financial strength, and the experience that those companies have in mega project, in mega infrastructure project. They have settled a plan to go through a decarbonization pathways. To get net zero, as been said before, is quite a very challenging pathway. It requires a lot of collaboration. In this regard, IOGP is also playing an important role to drive collaboration. And the first steps that oil and gas is called to achieve, and offshore industry is actually contributing dramatically on this, is reducing our own emission. So as a matter of fact, the first step that we need just as an oil and gas industry to take to be credible is to decarbonize our own Scope 1 emissions. And to get these, we need just to put in place as fast as possible a mix of projects and technologies. And let me share actually which are those technologies in a way. Adrian, please, if you can move to the, yes. So actually, the focus to decarbonize Scope 1 and make the first important achievement towards the net zero pathway is to deploy massively those 4 key initiatives. So first of all, carbon capture, transportation, and storage has been mentioned. We are still in an early phase. We have still few projects that are fully operational. We need to scale up. And this, besides also a massive electrification of and actually clean power, so clean electrification project for majority of the oil and gas facilities. This also will require a enhancement of the energy efficiency, all the fuel consumption optimization within our facilities. And then finally, something which is already in place over the last 10 years, as you may appreciate, there has been quite an important improvement in terms of flaring and venting, but actually we need just to be fully enhanced to get to a zero flaring status. Well, the combination of these 4 technologies implies a fundamental contribution by the offshore industries. And in this regard, also as IOGP representing the oil and gas, we are supporting all those project technologies by issuing a series of standards to uniformize, to homogenize the approach and assuring just a cost decrease curve, because actually you may appreciate that those investments, they don't have a return on investment as the normal investment. So there is quite a big concern in terms of the cost impact, but the only way just to do it is throughout a proper standardization. And actually, on the industry, on the offshore industry side, there would be a fundamental contribute in offering all the, starting from CCS, the amazing CO2 storage capacity, both in terms of gas depleted reservoir, and actually behind this there is a strong circular economy concept of reutilization of the depleted gas storage, but also saline aquifer, which offshore, thanks to God, we have actually plenty and full of important injectivity availability. And actually, beside this, it is now a reality of the offshore wind is indeed, with respect to the onshore wind, playing a fundamental role in terms also of reliability of the system. Again, is another example where offshore industry will be called to keep a fundamental role. And again, on the infrastructure that are now currently used for oil and gas transportation, well, they could be absolutely feasible throughout, of course, some proper re-rating, proper reassessment to be utilized for the transportation of CO2 or hydrogen. So actually, I do see a fundamental role, an enhanced role of offshore industry over the next 30 years, in line with the oil and gas pathway. And the key element that I'd like just to share also in this approach is the synergic, the integration among all these technologies. So cannot be only one technology, cannot be only just offshore wind or rather a CCS on energy efficiency. It's actually a combination of this in a proper portfolio of project to achieve the important net zero result. Thank you. And back just to Neil.
Yeah, thank you very much, Concetti. And that brings us to the end of our formal short talks. And we'll now bring the panel back together and have some Q&A. Hopefully you've sent some questions in, and have a short discussion during the course of the next 20 minutes. Well, I do have a question or two that I've been writing down as we've gone along. I especially liked the notion of synergy effects that I heard from Concetto a moment ago. And of course, it brings to mind things being better together. But for those of us who are ambitious, it also brings the opportunity for the oil and gas industry to grow its margins and to be present in other areas. So, for example, an LNG carrier could it run on wind power, supplemented wind propulsion, for example. But Concetto, expand on the idea of synergistic effects, and might the oil and gas company of 2050 be doing other things other than simply producing oil and gas?
Well, thanks, Neil. Actually, yeah, indeed. So the concept of an integrated offshore project, energy project, implies just an hub where you can have in the same area, you can have maybe just a platform already, so important infrastructure already deployed and verified from the asset integrity point of view, to locate some offshore wind facilities, but also to be the injection hub for the CCS project. So that well connected with also some important hub onshore, where you can have also important industrial emitters. As a matter of fact, on CCS, if we do have the backbone, so the infrastructure, that the capacity that there should be as economy of scale a bit larger than the specific CO2 emitters, then we do have an important economies of scale project. So the hub, the integrated offshore hub, having offshore wind, CCS, and also some residual maybe production of mainly gas production, is a good example where the synergies can appear within the offshore industry.
Let me take that question to Amir. The Caspian Sea, which is one of your areas, Amir, is quite historic. And in fact, I think it was the origins of the offshore business was in the Caspian Sea, if my memory serves me correctly. So there must be some quite depleted reservoirs as well as some contemporary ones. Is there a resource opportunity offshore in the Caspian beyond production, including injection and other things? Is there wind? Is there an offshore wind opportunity in Caspian?
Indeed, Neil. You have the wind, you have the solar energy as well. And these are all, as you know, these are aging fields, and it is the time for EOR and IOR, and these technologies will be of a great asset for these fields. And even for the fields which are relatively new, we still strongly believe that hybrid energy solutions has great potential in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Are there some resource processing projects, critical minerals, other things that could be integrated? We were talking about power stations and producing electricity in conjunction with CCS. Is that a feature of that area?
I strongly believe so. It's just a matter of delay that has happened post the pandemic, but the plans are there for different operators. And I would like to emphasize on the point that has been raised by Concetto and yourself about the synergy. It is the time for the industry to talk to each other. It's not taking an action is not an option. It is the time for us to think comprehensively and collaboratively, operators, service providers, academia, because the industry is facing an existence challenge per se. And it is the time for each of us to share the thoughts and ideas within a hub, within a kind of institution or a place where we can all put our thoughts together in different regions worldwide.
Yeah. In fact, Amir, you talked about the recruitment of young people and the reframing of the recruitment proposition as being something that's rather important. And it makes me wonder as well whether the place where people come from who work in our industry or our future industry will itself change as it becomes less popular in Europe and more and continues to be perfectly popular in other places. I wonder if that's what we'll see. But let me pass over to John. John, you were very clear-eyed about the rhetoric around supplying low carbon energy is one thing, but the production of traditional energy continues. And it raised in my mind the picture of supply side change versus demand side change. And I wondered whether you could respond to the criticism of whether change will be a substitution or whether it will be pushed on people by a carbon price, for example, is the classical methodology by which that is achieved. Or do you think that those of us who are innovators will pull it off and find a way of making low carbon solutions that are simply cheaper and better?
Yeah, that's the real crux of it, Neil, isn't it? And Eric started his presentation by saying it was sort of like at odds with mine, and I don't think that's the case. I was sort of trying to set out that if you are to get to net zero emissions, and we can't keep emitting carbon dioxide, and the net zero outcome there is pretty meagre. But as Eric rightly pointed out, the demand through population energy consumption is still going to be there. The question is, how do we meet that? And it's pretty hard to see today how you're not going to meet that without fossil fuels. One of the issues I have with the industry and a lot of its talk is it's very much focused around how do we reduce emissions or our plans to reduce emissions from our operations. And that's all very well and good. But if your customers are also trying to get to net zero emissions by 2050, they may not be wanting to buy your oil or your natural gas in 2050. They're going to be buying renewable power or building renewable power stations, things like that. So I think that looking at the demand side for how these energy flows is going to be critical. Now, I'm not saying that by 2050 demand for fossil fuels, I expect there's going to be very large demand. But if our traditional customers are also dead set on getting to zero emissions by 2050, then there's going to be some pretty big demand changes as well. Now, what's going to drive that? And I sort of touched on this issue. I see that governments seem to have lost the will to put in place the macro policy settings to drive this change. We had a spurt of that going back probably 10 or 20 years. I look around at the world at the moment, and having got some low-hanging fruit, they seem to be more interested in sort of nationalist protection of their industries than they are about reducing emissions. And it's hard to see how that's going to change. I don't think Western democracies are well suited to engineering their economies to the degree that's going to be required to get to net zero emissions. So either we don't get there or something else happens, and we are starting to see investor and stakeholder pressure driving some change. Will that be enough to get the answer we want, or will that be enough to drive the company's technology innovation? I think is the question going forward.
Do you think that the new bilateral and regional trade agreements will play a role? Because in the last sort of 30 years, we've seen an enormous freeing up of regional trade in Asia, and therefore certain things are done in certain countries for the purpose of industrialization based on policies that were really laid out in the 60s and 70s. So coal and iron ore goes to certain countries where it's made into steel, which is part of an integrated manufacturing. But do you think that the new round of regional policies might reset some of those value chains and retune them to be carbon neutral or more carbon neutral?
I think there's a couple of issues in there, Neil. I think one issue, well, the short answer is I don't think so, because I suspect that these trade agreements are going to be more inclined to be looking at trying to maximise local jobs in the various signatories to them one way or another. You do raise the other really fascinating point of, which we could have a whole panel session on, around the intricacies of reporting. At the moment, the global framework for reporting emissions is based on the production emissions rather than the consumption of emissions-intensive products and goods. And what you have with trade liberalisation is you have effectively the export of a lot of emissions to other economies. And I've done some work looking at some of those countries, for example, China, and the actual report emissions data coming out of China is very opaque. So countries that used to, you take Australia, for example, we used to have 7 car manufacturing plants in Australia. We now have none. We used to have 7 oil refineries. We now have, I think, 1 or 2 left. we're effectively exporting our emissions to other economies. So, you could claim our emissions are not going as much because of that, but it's very hard to see it. And I'm a great fan of trying to move to more of a emissions reporting framework where you report emissions based on your consumption of emissions rather than production emissions. And
John,
I think
we might call that emissions migration. I shall make a note of that. I think that's a good concept, global emissions migration. Tran, let me turn to you. You introduced the idea of co-benefits and change that is evolution and thriving in the change, which is very appealing. I like that picture. I want to be where you're working. So Tran, of the things that you're seeing in your work as an offshore engineer, as a flow assurance engineer within TechSea based in Singapore, which are the arenas that you think are the most exciting that we can all lean into and expect to flourish as we head towards 2050? What have you seen?
Oh, okay, thanks. Now, that's quite interesting questions. In fact, if I look at closely to our industry or even adjacent industry, actually a lot of focusing now is on the digitals, because a lot of applications or a lot of our current work, for example, reservoir or seismic analysis. In fact, we can using these technologies or automation to make our engineering much more better, and more we can create more value. So instead of spending so much of hours to do analysis, now we can put more of that efforts to do an evaluation of our economics or change in our energies transformation, rather than just doing evaluation of our real field, so that we can make a lot of quick decision. Or especially some of the field, right, we notice that instead of putting a lot of effort on that, we to find out the data, which using the machine learning actually is have us to analyze with a little of data. They will just predict based on whatever history that we have. So I think digitals will make a very good way forward. Yeah.
Do you think it could bring us to a world of machine design and machine manufacture and come to a solution that Eric pointed out that we needed, which was need to find a cheaper way of making this new stuff? We cannot have the old style of 2 years of front-end engineering design and then a lengthy procurement, filling in by hand these material takeoff sheets to order the valves or order the flanges. Instead, the machine has got to. Do you think that that's how it could go? That you press the button and the digital process does the design and manufacture?
Yes, that is one of the way. The fastest way that we are looking for, because we want to save time and then want to save energy. So if we automate most of our things, we can have a lot of, for example, from wind, we convert to energies and on sort of things. Instead of manually, we conversions, there's a lot of way for us to automate this process. And I think even in other areas of the energy transition, I think this will be one of the focus and driven us to next step of the industry.
Yeah. And do you think that digitalization might change the way that the demand side works? Because so far the whole spotlight is on supply, and the assumption is that people will carry on consuming more and more and more, and that's totally fine. I can't help thinking that in a future world, people will be more economic and more thoughtful in their consumption of energy resources, and perhaps some digital solutions will help, but it might be new technologies as well. I mean, one of my funny little concepts is the extra 1 billion people coming into Africa around 2050, 2070. Will they drive a Tesla, each one of them, or will they use public transport? Will they catch the bus, or will they not need to travel because they're living in an integrated community? Have you given some thought to the demand side of energy?
Oh, actually, instead of like you just now you mentioned for that example, right? Instead of people will drive their own car, or maybe the use of this public transport. In fact, internally we're also looking at some other ways like share transport, some form of similar like draft or Uber, but then it will also cost effective and also like some decarbonization emission reductions aspect as well. So I think there's some form of discussions ongoing, but how we are going to apply that, I think, is still a long journey for us to find a way. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, don't you agree, that Singapore will be one of the leading city-state economies, perhaps Dubai as well, actually, in terms of integrating how people live and work for low emissions lifestyle.
Yeah.
And in fact, that takes me back to Eric. One of the things, Eric, you pointed out was that we've become set on a 2050 question, whereas the Paris Accord, if one reads the legal statement, is
Hello.
Well, I think what Neil was talking about there is, this discussion's been about net zero by 2050, whereas the Paris Agreement talked about net zero in the second half of the century, which is somewhat different. Yeah. I think that's where he's going with his question. I don't know what else he's going to add to it. But.
Well, if I can, there is a lot of talk about the cost of doing nothing. Actually, the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to William Nordhaus for estimating the cost of doing nothing and various other strategies, and taking a business as usual strategy. Obviously, it's there. In a world with climate change, there are positives and benefits. There's a net negative impact on the well-being of humanity, but it's about 4% by the end of the century. So there are lots of ways in which we can do something that goes too far, and we need to do the right amount at the right time if we want humanity's overall welfare to increase. So certainly we have to act, but we need to be thoughtful about the actions that we do take. And the problem that I see often occurring is that people tend to have this tendency to make the perfect the enemy of the good. So we get locked into these these dichotomies of, well, whether it's the Australian Green Party, for example, scuttling an emissions trading scheme because it wasn't green enough, or the Conservative Party blocking a national energy guarantee because it wasn't pro-business enough. These sorts of issues we need, and the dichotomy, for example, between blue and green hydrogen is another one, which the cost of hydrogen is so large. The only way to get it down is to innovate and to grow the market. And the way you grow a market is by using the cheaper form initially to get people hooked on this cleaner fuel, not perfectly clean, but it allows you to start to develop the supply chains and the infrastructure that you need to get enough people, aggregate that demand and really drive the technology and the innovation that's needed to bring down the price of the greener side of the hydrogen production, for example. So certainly, I think that's we've got to factor in the costs of certain actions. Don't want to make the cure worse than the disease. And in all of these scenarios, I'd say we need innovation is going to be the way in which that we can make that progress. And I think, as Tran mentioned, the offshore industry is probably one of the world's best at actually developing and implementing innovative solutions.
I think you're right there, Eric. While we wait for Neil to come back, you made the point there about we need to grow these new markets for these new energy sources, and you want to do that in as low risk way as you can, because it's going to be hard enough to grow that demand anyhow. So trying to de-risk that process out is really important. And so the blue versus green hydrogen is a point in there. Case in point there. The other point you touched on is this trade-off. It's been, I guess, in the policy area for the last 10 years, the cost of mitigation versus the cost of adaptation, for want of a better way to look at it. And obviously that's complicated because you might decide to do a whole bunch of mitigation and reduce emissions, but if everybody else around the world doesn't, you still face the cost of adaptation on top of it. So there's a real complicated area there. It's one of these problems where it's not just your decisions that matter here; it's the actions of everybody else that matters in terms of determining the eventual costs. And I think what we're seeing is, the argument, for example, in Australia, that no matter what we do, it makes no difference if other economies don't do something similar. So how do we? I don't have the answer, but how do you make sure that the level of action is harmonised globally? And I'm not convinced that forums like the Paris Agreement or Kyoto are very effective at doing that. Yeah,
absolutely. I suspect one needs to incentivize CO2 via some price on carbon, but in a market-driven way that incentivizes people to come up with solutions that allow them to make money. That's usually what drives these things.
And that's the point I made. That what we need here is the macroeconomic policy settings that direct the economy where to go, rather than trying to dictate to the economy where to go. And that's I think the challenge we've got is that we're sort of moving out of, and it's not just the area of emissions and energy. Where governments, particularly in Australia, have moved well and truly away from worrying about macro policy settings to, subsidising pet projects left, right, and centre. And I think that's a really not the right way to go. But again, the problem is, how do you harmonise? If you do get to these macro policy settings, how do you get globally harmonised macro policy settings? And I think the FTC process tries to do that, but it doesn't work terribly effectively.
Indeed. I mean, another big area is the cost of replacing all the infrastructure that has already been developed. And talking with Japanese colleagues, I've learned that to transform the gas grid infrastructure needed to take pure hydrogen, it is $27 trillion. So even though so this means that making synthetic methane, although it's much more expensive, you've got to make the hydrogen first and then the methane. Actually, if you factor in the costs of having to change the infrastructure, becomes much more likely to be again an interim solution as we go through the longer term transition.
Yeah, and I guess today we've touched on things like CCS and what have you. But we haven't touched on this idea of bio renewable fuels, where you can get like for like replacement, but without the emissions footprint.
Okay. Welcome back, Neil.
Yes, nice to be here. It does help if you plug in into the mains properly. Apologies, everybody. Well, we're coming to the end of time. I suspect you answered, Eric, the question of 2050 versus second half of the century as per the actual agreement, and the fact that people have willfully misrepresented the Paris Accord in recent communications. So good for you. Yeah. Is there one more question that the panel have received that they would like to answer that I haven't passed on? Is there one? I think there's time for just one more. Amir or Tran or John or Eric? No. All right. I'd like to thank all of you for taking part and being such wonderful panelists on a very important topic. I don't think it's going to go away, but in this short period of time, I felt that we covered the space. Perhaps we were just getting into the investor tension. That was the other thing that was on my list if I hadn't vanished for a moment. But we'll have to pick that up next time, investor tension, along with decommissioning and recommissioning. But for now, I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the OTC Asia 2022 for taking part and preparing so carefully. I'd also like to thank the people who were behind the scenes with the production, producer Adrian Chong and organizer Stephanie Wong, along with the program coordinator, Chris Callie, also from OTC. So to all of everyone who's tuned in and listened, I hope it's been worthwhile and interesting. Please reach out to the panel members and carry on the conversation at OTC Asia in KL, online or in person. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.